Perfect. Neve already introduced me, but my name's Erin and I work with Jury. We're a PR and public affairs firm based in Dublin. And it's an agency, so we have lots of different clients across different sectors. It's a very fast-paced environment, which is very challenging for someone with hearing loss like me. So I'll be able to chat to you about some of that today and just talk about and when, like I say, it's challenging but not impossible. So that's what I'll talk about today, about some of the accommodations that I have in place that help me do my job. So I just to give you a bit of detail about my type of hearing loss, because I guess like one of the things that I want to communicate today is that deafness and hearing loss is so nuanced. There's more to it than simply hearing or not hearing. And I think sometimes when people hear the word deaf, they assume it means that someone communicates in sign language only, but that's not always the case. Because some people lose their hearing loss after they were born, either as a child or later in life. For me, it was a child. It gradually got worse. It started off, I guess you could say I was born in the hearing community, and then throughout my life, my hearing got worse and worse and worse until I went completely deaf. And then I got a cochlear implant 12 years ago. So, and I just realized before coming on to the webinar that will be 12 years ago tomorrow. So I will, I feel bad. I didn't order myself a cake for that. Yes, so just, yeah, that's just one thing to keep in mind. Just some of the tips I'll share about things to consider when you're hiring someone who's deaf or hard of hearing. It's going to be a different experience for everyone, but I do hope that sharing some of my personal experiences will help shed a little more understanding about it. So I'll just move to the first slide. So just some points I have up in here when you're interviewing someone who has hearing loss or is deaf. The first thing you need to do, I think, is ask them what kind of accommodations they need. For me, like anytime I've applied for a job, I've always been very upfront and said to the recruiter or to the hiring manager, just so you're aware, I'm hard of hearing, which means that I miss things here and there in conversation. I rely heavily on lip reading. So if this is a call that's going to be online, I would need to see your face. And if I don't set up those things, that I could be left in a situation where, you know, I could join a meeting on Teams, on Zoom for an interview, and people could have their cameras off. And then I'm left in the dark quite literally and can't follow very well. So usually someone who has got hearing loss or deafness will communicate that up front, because it's not, even though it's an invisible disability, it's not really something you can hide. So some other things to consider is it going to be online or is it going to be in person? So if it's online, make sure you enable captions. One thing I will say about captions, though, is they're not perfect. And I often joke that captions are deafer than me, because you just see all sorts of crazy stuff on the screen sometimes that is completely not what the person said. But then you can kind of like look at some words and kind of match them, think, oh yeah, that sounds a little like that. But I mean, if you've got hearing loss and you're used to mishearing things all the time, you're a little bit more skilled at interpreting the captions. Other key things to keep in mind is think about where you're sitting. So like if you have your back to the window, or if there's a bright light shining behind you, that's going to be glaring onto the face of the interviewee, and it's going to make things much more difficult to lip read. So like where I'm sitting right now, I hope at least that you can see my face clearly. But if I moved away a little into the shadow, or if I had my hand over my mouth like that, well, I mean, if you're someone like me with hearing loss, that's going to be pretty much a nightmare to try and keep up with. other things to consider are booking a sign language interpreter. And again, that's not for everyone. So for instance, in my case, because I lost my hearing as a child and like it gradually deteriorated, speech was always my first language. So I never grew up learning Irish Sign Language. It wouldn't make sense to have an interpreter in the room for me. So other accommodations I would be looking at is making sure that the person is facing me so I can lip read them. And just on the point of sign language, another point I'd like to make about that is understanding that it's different in every country. So we have a British Sign Language interpreter with us today, and I am currently learning Irish Sign Language at the moment, so I can see that the way we sign is very different in different countries. So there is no universal sign language. When you're like following the interview, I think the best thing you can do is to ask the interviewee how would they like to be contacted. In most cases, it depends on the level of hearing loss, how severe or profound it is, but usually I would prefer to be texted or emailed. I can do phone calls, but it's all very dependent on the situation. If I want to phone someone up and ask them some questions, that's a situation where I'm in control. It's much easier for me to hear, but or if for instance, in my line of work, sometimes we have to make calls to get information out of people. I could handle 20 minutes on the phone interviewing someone. But if a journalist were to ring me out of the blue and ask me a question about a client, that's a nightmare situation for me. I can't deal with calls where there's no context. But also, in light of that, like the more journalists I deal with, the more conversations I have with them, or with anyone really, the more I get used to the pattern of someone's voice. So the more exposed you are to someone's voice or to the way their mouth moves when lip reading, it becomes easier to hear people over time. So keep that in mind also, like when you're interviewing someone who's deaf or hard of hearing, if they're having trouble keeping up with you during that first interview, over time, the communication between the two of you is going to become much easier. So just on to reasonable accommodations. I suppose like just going back to that interview stage and looking for jobs as someone with hearing loss. Maybe 12 or 15 years ago, that experience would have been very daunting for me because we didn't have diversity, equity, and inclusion teams and organizations. And I suppose society has changed a lot since then in terms of how we accommodate employees with disabilities. To give you an example, when I was looking for jobs, when I finished my undergrad degree, I remember going for an interview and explaining the difficulty I have using the phone. And the interviewer said, well, that's going to be a problem for us if you can't use the phone. And I would hope in this day and age that isn't something that an interviewer would say to a potential candidate. But it does kind of like leave you feeling with a sense that I have to overcome disability in some way in order to fit in. And that's a very, I mean, it's internal ableism that's what it's called. Unfortunately for me, I've kind of moved on from those feelings over the years and worked to overcome that. And now that we have diversity, equity, and inclusion teams and people advocating for greater inclusion in the workplace, and like I understand now that I can do any job, but I do need to have reasonable accommodations in place. So you may have spoken about some of these already, but I'll just explain again. There's a reasonable accommodations passport scheme in Ireland, and the way this is designed it's designed for like a hiring manager or a direct line manager to sit down with the employee and assess any kind of barriers in the workplace that arise that prevent them from doing their job that's directly related to their disability. So the goal of that is to look down at what supports could be in place to help you overcome those barriers and do your job effectively. And the key to this is the word reasonable. They have to be reasonable both for the employee and for the company, so that so that you're both getting the most out of it. So for example, I'll move on to the examples in a minute, but the reasonable accommodation passport scheme, if you want to find out more about that, you can go to the website of Employers for Change, and that actually gives you the template for filling out the passport, and for both employers and employees. Neve, if you need to cut across me at all and jump in or anything, please do, but maybe give me a wave just in case I don't hear you, because I'm deaf. So
I know. I have my camera on. You have 3 more minutes.
Okay, 3 more minutes. Okay, I'll just talk very quickly through some of the accommodations I have in place. So if you've got hearing loss, it's very difficult to take notes. Multitasking is very difficult. And the reason for that is when you're trying so hard to keep up with what was said, you're missing out on what the next thing that was said. So some of the accommodations I have in place is to ensure that there's someone else on the team to provide a recap of actions from a meeting after it ends, and that helps me move the project forward. Whenever I need to be briefed on any project or task, I always need a written brief. I'm more of a visual learner because of hearing loss, so it's much easier to keep things in my memory once I've read it as opposed to hearing it. Another accommodation I have in place is back-to-back meetings. So that's something to keep in mind with employees who are deaf or hard of hearing. We get a lot of listening fatigue, and that's from constantly listening all day and lip reading all day. It's really hard work, and you can get a little bit of cognitive overload and left feeling a bit of burned out. So avoiding back-to-back meetings really helps battle that cognitive fatigue. And but you know, hearing loss or not, we shouldn't be doing back-to-back meetings anyway. So it's best to have a little bit of time to decompress. Sorry, Neve, what did you say?
I'm not sure if your sound is going down a little.
Okay, can you still hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
But we agree on back-to-back meetings.
You agree on back-to-back meetings. Okay, good. Okay, nobody's a fan of those. Let's just abolish them completely. That's sorted. So yeah, so I've explained listening fatigue as well, just in the context of back-to-back meetings. Having captions in meetings is really, really helpful. Again, like I said earlier, they're not 100% reliable because they don't always get everything right. But I do find that if I rely on them too heavily, I can miss out on what's being said. So I prefer to have them as a support. If I get tired of listening, then I can look at the captions and catch up on anything that I'm having trouble keeping up with. And then just another accommodation I have in place is reducing phone work where possible. Like I mentioned earlier, I would be quite comfortable ringing someone up and chatting to them for 20 minutes. But if someone called me out of the blue and if it was a 5-second phone call, that would be a disaster for me. So I guess I suppose the key point I want to make today is that, you know, working with an employee who's deaf or hard of hearing is going to be a different experience for everyone. Like what works for me mightn't necessarily work for someone else with a different level of hearing loss to me, or even the same hearing loss to me. I think, you know, there's different, you know, technology, there's different supports you can put in place, but I think the key thing is continuing to have conversations with employees, asking them what supports are working for them, asking does anything need to be changed, and that's where the reasonable passport scheme comes in, because that allows you to like revise and renew, and it's all about adapting. It's not about getting to a certain point where you're just happy and satisfied with that. It's always by tweaking and adapting to ensure that the employee can keep up, and also the employer is happy with everything as well. So so yeah, I hope all that is useful. I wish I could stay for the whole webinar, but unfortunately I have to go. As like I said, fast-paced agency life, it's non-stop. But thank you, Niamh, for inviting me here today, and also I will share my LinkedIn with Niamh afterwards if anyone would like to get in touch. I'm open to talking about hearing loss and sharing experiences anytime. I'm very comfortable with it. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much. I had my camera off there for almost all, but the amount of nodding and agreeing that I was doing with you that you wouldn't have seen there. And what I love especially about all of this, and I will let you drop off, is that none of these accommodations cost money. Every single thing you mentioned here is something that everyone can implement and just be mindful of. And sometimes that's the fear or the worry for companies is, what do I have to put in place? What do I have to do? How much is it going to cost me? And nothing you said here today costs anybody anything. And it sounds like you have a really good team where you are now as well to understand that support, helping you with the written briefs and things like that. So I think they're great tips. And I'm sure hiring managers and people would love to hear these when they do engage with somebody who has a hearing loss or is deaf coming to work for their organization. So Erin, thank you so much. I've shared your LinkedIn. Again, I think this is a conversation we can have again. And we're going to move on now to a panel discussion. I'll let you drop off, Erin.
Okay, I will stop presenting and leave. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks. That was great. Bye-bye.